Hi, Laura. Welcome back. This is
Thank
your
you.
second time coming to the Green Summit. Delighted to have you here. Before we kick off, just a reminder: if you point your cameras at the QR codes, you can submit questions, which Meg here in the front row will ask us, will pitch to us towards the end of our conversation. So, Laura, do you want to kick us off a little bit? I mean, you're all about climate litigation. Do you want to tell the room here just a little bit about what exactly you do and some of the big cases you've been involved in recently?
Absolutely. So at ClientEarth, the clue is in the name. The earth is our client. And we use the law to drive the positive change we need to tackle the climate, pollution, and biodiversity crises. And we're most known for our climate litigation because those are the cases that hit the headlines. But actually, we use the whole life cycle of the law. So we work to strengthen the law by getting the right legislation in place or even drafting it for governments. So when you get a really good EU deforestation regulation in place, for example, it ensures that any products sold in the EU are not complicit in any way in deforestation in their supply chains. So we work to strengthen the law. We use strategic litigation to hold governments and corporates to account for their climate commitments. And when you bring the right intervention at the right point, that can set a very powerful precedent and affect change. And thirdly, we build the field. So we train lawyers, prosecutors, judges. We work with community groups so that more and more people are equipped to use the law to drive the change for people and planet.
Yeah. And so what has struck you here? What's been your mission at this COP? Yeah.
So our mission here, I'd highlight two big things that we're focused on. One is the importance of using the law to turn international pledges into real action. And so we're advocating for countries to have national framework climate laws which really set out across the board and across all parts of government how are you going to deliver. And really legislation, regulation is the key in making that happen. Secondly, the right laws, the right rules for fossil fuel phase out. And that's a whole mix of, we're obviously looking at things like subsidies, but also very important that we've got a very clear eye on things like greenwashing. And actually what we would like to see is something akin to the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, whereby there are limits on what fossil fuels can do in terms of advertising, sponsoring of events, or even a policy engagement. So you wouldn't invite tobacco companies to a health or cancer conference, for example. So those are our big objectives.
And we'll talk about some of your successes later, but of course, as you well know, climate litigation can be a bruising business, and you recently lost a case taken against Shell. The UK High Court dismissed your attempt to launch an action against the directors of that company for failing to sort of live up to their responsibilities as regards the climate. Can you tell us a little bit about the substantive issues of that case and how it evolved?
Absolutely. So it was a world first case. It was the first time that someone had taken a case against the directors personally, the directors of a company personally. And so it was a derivative action, meaning it was a shareholder action. As ClientEarth, we held shares in Shell, and we argued that the directors were not doing enough to manage climate risk, and in so doing they weren't safeguarding the long-term commercial viability of the company. And our claim was backed by by institutional investors with 12 million worth of shares who said that this case was in their best interests. And really I think it's critical that directors, when they're thinking about long-term commercial viability, they are managing climate risk. And that's both the physical risk of climate events, it's transition risk, so what happens if you're investing in fossil fuels and they become a stranded asset, and there's also the litigation and reputational risk. The High Court refused to hear the case in substance, which we think is a real missed opportunity to clarify in legal terms the responsibility of directors, but it did acknowledge that directors have a duty to manage climate risk. And we're very clear, even though this has been a setback, it will only be a matter of time before directors are found personally liable for not managing climate risk. And that's hugely powerful in terms of influencing behaviors and decision making. And I think there's something there also in that, even though you lose a case, that doesn't mean it hasn't had impact, because the case has been talked about in boardrooms around the world.
Right, because we think, if you're not a lawyer, you tend to think about court cases as sort of like in the movies. There's winners and there's losers, there's cheering and there's crying at the end of it. But actually, it's more subtle than that, isn't it?
Absolutely. So this was a case that was talked about in conferences of general counsels, it was talked about in boardrooms around the world, and it sent a ripple effect around. So no one will be breathing a sigh of relief. And I think it also raises that understanding of the responsibility of directors to really lead in the long-term interests of a company and its shareholders.
Directors need to watch out because ClientEarth might be watching you. I mean, oil companies, excuse me, oil companies are the obvious ones, but are there other sorts of industries where similar cases could be taken?
So I think absolutely, and I think the big theme is this around personal liability. Yeah.
Yeah. So greenwashing is another something else that you're very, very involved in. Can you talk us a little bit about the cases where you've had successes?
Yes.
On greenwashing and maybe some ongoing cases as well, just to give us a sense of how you think about this.
Absolutely. So we at ClientEarth we've had what we call our greenwashing files, which is a whole host of cases against greenwashing, which at its most basic is misleading advertising and communication. And our first case was against BP for its advertising campaign called Opportunities Everywhere, which suggested that the company was investing hugely in the renewable transition, when in fact, in the high 90s, 98% of its investments were still in oil and gas. And a result of that complaint, they withdrew that advertising campaign. And the CEO, Bernard Looney, said they would no longer do reputational advertising in that way. So that was a real success. We have two really interesting cases ongoing at the moment. One is against KLM, and we're supporting that case. We filed it last year. We're now supporting our partner in the Netherlands, Frey, and that's against KLM's advertising campaign called About Sustainable Flying, and its use of offsets, or fly responsibly was its campaign, and we're essentially saying that they are misleading the consumer and making them feel that it's okay to keep flying, because with the talk of sustainable aviation fuel and with offsets, that's implying that aviation is sustainable when in fact the only real answer is reducing demand. And I think that's quite critical. It comes to a theme of false solutions.
Yeah.
Sustainable aviation fuel is in a tiny percentage. It's something like 0.1% currently. And we know that offsets do not compensate for emissions produced. And so it's a false complacency that is bred there.
And just to give, this is obviously a global audience here, just to give a sense of your sort of, your reach. Obviously, we've talked about UK companies, we've talked about KLM, a Dutch company. Are you just European focused, or are you also pursuing cases elsewhere in the world?
So we work in different ways in different jurisdictions. So we also work on we work with community groups. So in West Africa, we worked in Côte d'Ivoire to support local community groups there to improve the forest code and get a new forest code in place, which is now meaning that they're reforesting locally, which is incredibly important. In China, we train judges at the request of the Supreme Court of China. In the Philippines, we're engaging on regulatory reform to support the renewable transition. So we're working in different ways, using the law in different ways in different jurisdictions.
And just a reminder to everyone, you can post questions using the QR code, so we'll get some questions in a minute.
But I'll just come in. So, but the false solutions, I think, is interesting because that's true also in the plastics industry. We talk about recyclability, where we launched a case recently against Coca-Cola, Danone, and Nestle for their claims that their plastic water bottles are 100% recyclable and recycled, when we know that actually only 9% of plastic is ever really recycled. And on the current growth trajectory of plastics, there will be more plastic than fish in the ocean by 2050. So there are false solutions in terms of claims of recyclability. There are false solutions from government as well. And so we currently have a case against the UK government for its revised net zero strategy, which relies too much on untested, unproven, high-risk technologies like carbon capture and storage, and not enough on the things that we know work, like energy reduction in terms of energy demand reduction, in terms of insulating houses, public transport, behavioral change.
Just to push back on a little bit, or if I was a government official in the Treasury, I might push back on that a little bit and say, let's take carbon capture.
Yeah.
Yes, we don't have it to scale yet. It is a relatively nascent, well, it's not nascent, it's been around a long time, but we still haven't quite figured out how to scale it up. Many, many, many of the net zero projections, ratified by the UN, et cetera, concede the fact that carbon capture can and should be part of net zero solutions. Some might say that's unfair.
So it absolutely is going to need to be a part. But I think the point with this carbon budget delivery plan is it relies far too much. Right. And so it doesn't all add up. And what you need to do is you need to do as much as you can in terms of emissions reductions and changing how things are operating. And then, of course, you're going to need carbon removal technologies, carbon capture and storage, and carbon credits for the really hard to abate areas. But if you say we've got, we're relying on 20%, say, being delivered by carbon capture and storage, that's not yet proven and tested. And so you need to have much more of really predictable, high confidence emissions reduction strategies.
Meg, do we have any questions?
We do. Sorry, I just accepted a bunch and they disappeared on me. Hold on. Here they are. Okay. Can you comment on new legislation requiring alignment of financial regulators and NDCs?
Sorry, say again. Comment on.
Can you comment on new legislation requiring alignment of financial regulators and NDCs?
Globally, is that I think essentially regulation is really key because, again, this comes back to, I suppose, what I was talking about with the climate laws and climate compatible decision making is that you need to have, it's not enough to have a net zero target or even a law, you need to make sure that all parts of government and the state are having in mind those targets when they're making decisions. And so when decisions are made on, say, for a financial regulator on listing a certain company, how do they consider climate risk when they do that? And we actually brought a case against the Financial Conduct Authority for its decision to approve the prospectus of an oil and gas company when that prospectus hadn't set out clearly enough the climate risk of new investment in oil and gas. And so I think regulators, treasuries, any decisions that are being made on infrastructure, on investment, they need to have in mind the climate goal at hand.
What was the result of that case against the FCA? That's the UK Financial Conduct Authority.
It's ongoing.
It's ongoing.
Yeah.
Meg?
Do you believe shareholders will be the next to be held accountable?
Oh.
That's a good one.
That's a good one, and I don't know. I haven't heard about that, but I think there is an increasing emphasis on shareholders using their influence to engage and to try and influence. But it's an interesting one. I think that's very much a watch this space question.
One more?
Moving on from your landmark case against directors of Shell, what, in your opinion, is the threshold directors have to meet to avoid meeting ClientEarth in court in the future?
I think, look, that's a really good question because I think what I always say is, as ClientEarth, we don't want to make the best the enemy of the good. So there are so many, and one of the big stories at this COP is the huge leadership that is being shown by the corporate sector, the enormous efforts being made in leaning into the transition. And so we want to really support those efforts and say this is what good looks like in legal terms. These are the responsibilities of directors. This is what a really good Paris-aligned net zero strategy looks like. But it's then when you have a very clear failure to manage risk, that we want to take action and really just try and set an example. And so when there's a complete disconnect between the statement, what an organization and its board says it's doing in terms of climate commitments, and the reality, and where that might be the inadequate net zero transition strategy, it might be lobbying in a way that's totally counter to its stated aims in climate terms.
Can I pick up on that actually and talk about how you view the enablers, so the sort of the cottage industry around big engineering industries and oil and gas, et cetera, the PR firms, the consultancies. We were talking about that earlier, and it sort of sounds like one that could perk up a lot of ears.
I think if we're thinking about next themes and next trends in terms of climate litigation, I would say what I call the under-the-radar enablers. I mean, if you think about a new oil pipeline, you can't do it without getting the insurance, without the lawyers doing the contracting, without the PR company doing the PR for you. And increasingly, there are these concepts of advised emissions for consultancy firms, advertised emissions for PR firms, lawyered emissions. And I think the big thing I would say is all of us at scale across our economy and society just need to become much more climate competent, much more climate fluent, so that if you're a lawyer, if you're a consultant, if you're a PR company, you're understanding the climate science and the crisis, and you're thinking about your role, who are you working with, how do you influence them, should you be working with them? And I think that's really key.
And can you give me a sense, what would your legal argument be? Let's say I'm a consultancy, I'm helping an oil company, you know, figure out how to do an M&A deal or figure out how to build a pipeline. I might say, look, this oil and gas is not illegal. There's nothing illegal about it. They've asked me for a financial service. I'm providing them that service. I'm not on the. How would you argue the legal peril?
I think you could easily link it to it's essentially a greenwashing argument, but those who are enabling it, looking at misleading consumer practices. But it really depends. I mean, in a way, what we do at ClientEarth is we start with the impact we're trying to have, and then we work out what the right legal vehicle is. So I think that's critical, that everyone is thinking about, no one says, oh, well, I don't know how to deal with computers. So everyone needs to be thinking about how they deal with the climate and what their responsibility is. And that law, I think, is a really powerful tool in concentrating the minds and thinking about what can we all do in our own way to drive the change we need to see.
Meg, do we have any other final questions? Or I have one final one, but.
I can do there's a COP related one that might be a good one to end on, which is, do you feel like there's been enough climate litigation involved here in COP?
I think it's been talked about a lot, but it's not really part of the main program. But I think it is a very useful nudge factor. And in fact, just before COP started, there was a case in Belgium where the Belgian authorities were ordered by the courts to reduce their emissions by 55% by 2030. So it is really putting a pressure. And the other thing I'd say, which is a fascinating dynamic underway at the moment, are the advisory opinions before the International Court of Justice and the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, which are asking these international courts to clarify what are the duties of states in tackling the climate crisis, in terms of whether that's for avoiding marine pollution or whether it's for the human rights of current and future generations in climate vulnerable countries. And so bringing that pressure from above, from the international courts, I think is a really interesting theme, and there have been lots of discussions about that this COP.
Well, one last closing question we touched on, we sort of touched on this earlier, but if you look out into society and the law and the courts reflect society, and it's like an ongoing conversation between the law and society. We are seeing more skepticism about net zero from the political level, from other angles as well. Is the judiciary becoming more conservative? Let's take the UK. Do you feel like the judiciary is becoming more conservative on climate affairs? Do you feel like they are more climate literate than they were a few years ago?
I think there's still a long way for the courts and for judges to become much more climate literate. I think that's absolutely true. I think that generally it's very interesting the way sometimes politics gets involved in climate, but actually when you look across the board, everyone wants their kids to grow up in a clean and healthy environment, to be able to breathe clean air. And I think the role that the law has is taking it beyond that short-term thinking of the next election or the short-term profit, and thinking long-term. And when you set the right laws and you set the right regulation, then actually you're creating that long-term thinking. And the courts are, of course, an critically important part of that. You need that long-term thinking for the long-term good of the planet and for people, and that's what the law can do.
Well, on that note, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you.
Thank you.